From the PEP Radio Newsroom, these are the stories we are following at this hour. A federal judge on Monday refused to block the Internal Revenue Service from sharing immigrants' tax data with Immigration and Customs Enforcement for the purpose of identifying and deporting people illegally in the United States. In a win for the Trump administration, U.S. District Judge Dabney Friedrich denied a preliminary injunction in a lawsuit filed by nonprofit groups. They argued that undocumented immigrants who pay taxes are entitled to the same privacy protections as U.S. citizens and immigrants who are legally in the country. Friedrich, who was appointed by President Donald Trump, had previously refused to grant a temporary order in the case. The decision comes less than a month after former acting IRS Commissioner Melanie Krause resigned over the deal, allowing ICE to submit names and addresses of immigrants inside the U.S. illegally to the IRS for cross-verification against tax records. Alan Butler Morrison, the attorney representing the nonprofit groups, noted that the judge's ruling made it clear that the Department of Homeland Security and the Internal Revenue Service can't venture beyond the strict limitations spelled out in the case. In other news, the Episcopal Church's Migration Service is refusing a directive from the federal government to help resettle white South Africans granted refugee status, citing the church's longstanding commitment to racial justice and reconciliation. Presiding Bishop Sean Rowe announced the step Monday, shortly before 59 South Africans arrived at Dulles International Airport outside Washington on a private charter plane and were greeted by a government delegation. Episcopal Migration Ministries instead will halt its decade-long partnership with the government, Rose said. President Donald Trump opened a fast-tracked refugee status to white South Africans, accusing their government of discrimination, even as his administration abruptly shut down the overall U.S. refugee program. The South Africans jumped ahead of thousands of would-be refugees overseas who had been undergoing years of vetting and processing. The Episcopal Migration Ministries has long resettled refugees under federal grants. Rose said that about 2 weeks ago, the government contacted it and said it expected the ministry to resettle some of the South Africans under terms of its grant. In light of our church's steadfast commitment to racial justice and reconciliation and our historic ties with the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, we are not able to take this step, Rose said. Accordingly, we have determined that by the end of the federal fiscal year, we will conclude our refugee resettlement grant agreements with the U.S. federal government. And finally, here's some good news for morticians and funeral parlor directors. House Republicans have unveiled the cost-saving centerpiece of President Donald Trump's big, beautiful bill. At least $880 billion in cuts, largely to Medicaid, to help cover the cost of its $4.5 trillion in tax breaks. Tallying hundreds of pages, the legislation revealed late Sunday is touching off the biggest political fight over health care since Republicans tried but failed to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, during Trump's first term in 2017. While Republicans insist they are simply rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse to generate savings with new work and eligibility requirements, Democrats warn that millions of Americans will lose coverage. A preliminary estimate from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office said the proposals would reduce the number of people with health care by 8.6 million over the decade. Savings like these allow us to use this bill to renew the Trump tax cuts and keep Republicans' promise to the hardworking middle-class families, said Representative Brett Guthrie of Kentucky, the GOP chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which handles healthcare spending. Except the tax cuts aren't intended for middle-class families. They only benefit the top 1% of income earners. But Democrats said the cuts are shameful and essentially amount to another attempt to repeal Obamacare. Well, shameful is an understatement. These cuts will be downright lethal. In no uncertain terms, millions of Americans will lose their health care coverage, said Representative Frank Pallone of New Jersey, the top Democrat on the panel. He said hospitals will close, seniors will not be able to access the care they need, and premiums will rise for millions of people if this bill passes. Perhaps more importantly, and what has gone unsaid by either political party, is that more people will end up dead. They'll end up dead at a faster pace simply due to a lack of access to medical care. That's the morning news. If you didn't like it, you better do something about it. If this news didn't cheer you up, call your local congressional reps and senators and tell them to vote against this noxious, hideous package of spending cuts that will hurt most Americans. Which brings us to our next topic. Primary election day is May 20th, and today is the last day to request a mail-in or absentee ballot. You have until 5 p.m. to submit one to your local voter registration office. Up next is the National Weather Service forecast for the Meadville area here on PEP Radio.